So I would say that for me, and maybe others, the way you first interact with Nigerian culture is through its music more than its cinema. And if you interact with its music, you'll probably have heard of Fela Kuti, who is such a phenomenal musician. He kind of created a genre of Afrobeat. And I remember growing up and my uncle having lots of his albums because his songs are not so much songs as sets, just like this mix of kind of Miles Davis, late years, free jazz, soul, and African rhythms that just go for like 20 minutes of drug induced kind of just it's a scene, it's a vibe.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
there are there's a handful of documentaries you can watch to understand Fela Kuti, lots of stuff on YouTube. I think the one people more often have heard of is Finding Fela, which was directed by Alex Gibney, who's, an Oscar winning, very famous documentarian. And that documentary was, I think it was conceived when there was a Broadway show called Fela about his music. And it's a well-made documentary. There's nothing wrong with it. But the one I have recommended is one called My Friend Fela, or Meu Amigo Fela, by Joel Zito Araújo, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, that was brought out in 2019. And he's a Cuban director. And why I like this one is because I feel that it's very even-handed about Fela Kuti. So we can do the positive and the negative. He's this fantastic musician, also traveled to the UK, traveled to the USA. He had a classical music education in London. He spent time with the Black Panthers in America, which really, I think, not formed his political conscience, but helped him articulate it. He came back to Nigeria and, had this amazing nightclub that was a total scene. Almost created like a charismatic political movement that was critical of all the corruption. This is the time when Nigeria discovers its oil wealth, and you start seeing the elites, even post-colonial, but nothing really improves because then the elite Black people take all the petrochemical money and kind of create the society that we then see in the film that you suggested, Duncan. So he becomes a huge critic of the government, and the government go after him. They go after his family, and you see the appalling sort of price he pays for that through political harassment. His wife, or some of his wives, plural, are raped by government agents, and it's it's really a brutal document of, I guess, Nigeria in that period, post-colonial, but being corrupted in its own way through petrochemical wealth and the inequality of that. And also, the rise of Pan-Africanism, which was very present when I used to go back to Kenya in the 80s. This idea that maybe African nations had more in common, that they had a part, and that they should band together, and, kind of the same period as Pan-Arabism. So for people who like post-colonial studies, you can see it all through Fela's lives. But why I like this doc is it's very even-handed. So it talks about how amazing he is as a musician, how influential as a political freedom fighter and activist. But Fela Kuti is not he is not a feminist, even though his mum was a feminist. He believes, or justifies, who knows how cynical this was, that he can express his tribal, authentic way of living by taking many, many wives or concubines. So he basically has this harem, and he does not treat these women well. There's footage in the film of kind of like, physical abuse of women, huge sexism. So I think I really like this film because I think, as with many of these famous figures, we're all human. We have very many facets to our lives, and I think a good documentary should show all of those facets. So yeah, that's My Friend Fela.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this documentary. I had never heard of this person, so I have been loving going through Spotify and listening to his songs, which are
Yay.
awesome.
Yeah.
They don't feel, I mean, they're from the 70s, but they don't, they're just as fun and vivacious. And I was playing it in the lounge room today, and my little infant was dancing along. She really enjoyed
Yay.
it. Yeah, it is cool. It's like, it is just a vibe. And there are lyrics, but it's really just an amazing mix of jazz and funk, saxophone. There was some clarinet in one of the songs we listened to, which my partner loved because she plays clarinet. And yeah, it was just a really nice groove. And I thought it was interesting. Part of the documentary is that he started off just as any other, musician, singer, but gradually, as he started interacting with more people in the kind of civil rights movement or the Pan-African movement, his songs became more political, and he used it, that was his instrument, and he used it to speak up for African people and African diaspora, including the descendants of slavery in the United States, and attacked his own government, guilty and still are, were for a long time guilty of civil rights violations and various atrocity and corruption. So he was a fascinating sort of figure in his own right, an artist, but also just kind of this locus of all these amazing radical things that were happening in the 60s and 70s. And even I think it was interesting coming from the subject, Carlos Moore, who is a fascinating figure in his own right, and a big writer and activist and political agitator. And their articulations of what Pan-Africanism is really interesting, and it's a very unique movement. And it's funny to think of like this whole series of sort of national cinemas. We sort of divide it by country. A country like Nigeria, the borders of that country were not necessarily drawn up by the indigenous people of that country. They were drawn up by European colonizing powers who drew it up as real estate, things like that. So it's funny, I think Pan-Africanism shows that some people can't be divided into country, that some movements dissolve borders and some movements promote solidarity between people from different places who have similar struggles and similar cultural backgrounds and similar goals.
Yeah, it's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, like the oppressed people of the United States and Brazil and Haiti and Africa as well.
Yeah.
That's how it worked. And music is such a powerful connective tissue for that, because it can transcend language, and it can it's like that.
Yeah.
And
I mean, again, we get back to Marxism, right? An oppressed worker in Lagos is going to have more in common with an oppressed worker in Syria and London, probably, than an elite person in Lagos and an oppressed worker in Lagos, right? I mean, and also I think an interesting part of Africa is tribes, and often the tribal identity is stronger than the national, because, as you say, the national's kind of somewhat arbitrary, and the tribal is strong, and a lot of the kind of the way the wealth is distributed and government posts and posts of power are distributed in some of these post-colonial powers is by tribe, which I think Fela Kuti kind of understood very well.
And national borders, in many ways, that have been imposed upon this continent are a way of kind of dividing and conquering. But if you can connect different groups from all over the world for a common cause, you can amass more power. You don't have to think of it as Nigerians versus Haitian, Nigerians versus Brazil.
Oh, they do. I mean, like, if you ever see Nigerian and Ghanaian people argue about who has the best jollof rice, it's hilarious. So I think that, what happens though is, like, these may have been like artificially imposed borders, but 50 years later, they become self-fulfilling. And to me, the dream of Pan-Africanism has died, hasn't it? Because now there is a great deal of Nigerian versus Ghanaian versus Ivory Coast kind of like pride, and also you just see it on all sorts of like economic rivalries, but also expressions around the World Cup that we've just had, all that kind of stuff. So
yeah. And in some ways, it's kind of sad watching something like this and seeing all of these people with such passion and hope.
Yeah, he was naive in a way, though. I mean, if you create a compound in the center of Lagos and then declare it its own republic of yourself, I mean, of course the government's going to have beef with.
Yeah. I mean, Kuti himself was very largely, had an inflated sense of what he was capable of. But even things like singing in this kind of pidgin English kind of crisscross of languages, I thought was interesting, because it allowed him to connect with more people, which was what his goal was. But yeah, I mean, as you said, the documentary is even-handed, and it interviews at least one of his wives, and she expresses how tough it was to actually live with him and live in that arrangement.
Yeah.
And the fact that, she calls it a harem, and Carlos tries to smooth it and make it more attractive. But I mean, she was the one that was actually married to him, so I trust her account better.
And that's why I like this version. I mean, Finding Fela is easier to find, so I think more people watch it. But this does give a voice, or tries to give a voice to the women, which I really appreciate. So yeah.
And even I think they were talking about his first wife and the fact that she demanded she be considered the top wife. So there was this hierarchy, and
Yeah,
it's hard to, it's tricky. It's
putting
such a tricky thing because we think about individual can be capable of good and bad attributes, and even movements like Pan-African can contain these competing elements and ideologies that don't really cohere. I mean, it's difficult to cohere this kind of return to tribal purity with ideals like femininity. It's tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really provocative. It really makes you think. I think a lot of what Fela played in his music, but a lot of what he did in his life makes you think. But I'm strongly of the opinion you can enjoy the art without validating everything that the life was about. And yeah, I love Fela Kuti's music. So, and if anyone gets the chance to see Fela, if it ever gets revived, it's a great show. So it was a real sensation when it played here.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but it seemed to be part of that craze of kind of jukebox musicals. So they actually
Yes.
used his songs and then used that to kind of weave a narrative of his life.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, definitely. It is a tricky documentary to find. Like you can Finding Fella on YouTube if you just want an overview of his life. But My Friend Fela, I could only find it on Vimeo. You have to rent it. But it is there. The French is not translated, but most of it's in English, so you only miss like 5% of it. But check it out. But probably more importantly, check out his music.
Yeah,
Just
just
go
go
on
to Spotify.
Spotify.
Just listen to some Fela.
Yeah, it's really good. It's just really good to just chuck on in the background. It's really fun.